Nobody in Haywood County thought much of it at first. A 10-year-old girl crouched in the dirt behind the henhouse most mornings that spring, crushing eggshells in an old coffee can with the back of a spoon, then carrying handfuls of the pale grit out to the garden and working it into the soil around every single plant, one at a time, on her knees, unhurried, like the task itself mattered more than getting it done quickly. By the middle of June, she had gone through more eggshells than the family's 14 hens could reasonably produce in a season, and she'd started knocking on doors 2 farms over asking neighbors to save theirs. Her name was Junie Hargett, and by the time this story is finished, you'll understand why a county extension office ended up photographing a 10-year-old's garden plot for an official bulletin, and why her own mother, a woman not given to sentiment about garden folklore, kept a coffee can of her own on the kitchen counter for the rest of her life. If you appreciate stories about patience, family, and the kind of ordinary wisdom that gets lost and then found again a generation later, subscribe and settle in, because this one takes its time. Haywood County sits in the rolling hill country of western North Carolina, folded into the eastern edge of the Great Smoky Mountains, where the soil runs a deep rust red with clay and the growing season is short enough that everybody's garden matters a little more than it might somewhere flatter and warmer. Frost can come late in May some years and early again by the middle of September, which means a family's kitchen garden isn't a hobby out there so much as a genuine piece of the household budget, and everybody who's farmed that ground for more than a generation has learned to respect a short window and unforgiving soil in roughly equal measure. The Hargetts kept 18 acres outside the small town of Clyde, a mix of pasture, a modest tobacco allotment that had shrunk every single year since the federal buyout program ended most of the county's tobacco economy in the early 2000s, and a half-acre kitchen garden that Junie's mother, Odessa, had tended every summer since before Junie was born. Odessa had grown up 2 counties over in a family that farmed more out of necessity than tradition, and she brought to her own garden a practicality that bordered on suspicion of anything she couldn't explain with a straight scientific answer. She kept a soil test on the refrigerator door most years, updated the amendments accordingly, and had very little patience for the kind of garden folklore that got passed around at church potlucks without anybody bothering to check whether it actually worked. Junie's father, Ray, worked most of the year for the county road department, driving a grader through the winter months and doing culvert repair the rest of the time, and farmed what he could manage on evenings and weekends alongside it. He was a practical man in a different way than his wife, less interested in explanations and more interested in results, the kind of person who would try something once if it seemed reasonable and drop it without much discussion if it didn't produce anything worth the effort. It was Junie's great-aunt Vernie who planted the idea, though nobody in the family understood at the time how far it would eventually travel. Vernie Ledbetter was 83 years old that spring, lived on a small place 2 farms over that had been in her husband's family since the 1930s, and had kept a garden every single summer since the early 1950s that regularly outproduced her neighbors by a wide enough margin that people had mostly stopped asking her secret and simply accepted it as one of the fixed and slightly mysterious facts of the community, the way you accept that a certain creek always runs high in April weather or not. You understand exactly why. Vernie's garden was the subject of a mild, ongoing, good-natured envy among the women at the Clyde Baptist Church, several of whom had asked her over the years what she did differently and gotten, depending on her mood, either a genuinely thoughtful answer or a shrug and a comment about good luck. Junie spent most Saturdays that spring at Vernie's place, mostly because her great-aunt let her eat tomatoes straight off the vine without washing them first, which felt to a 10-year-old like a rare and slightly forbidden kind of freedom that her own mother, more careful about such things, didn't generally allow. It was on one of those Saturdays in April, the ground still cool enough that Vernie was working in a canvas jacket, that Junie noticed a strange pale grit worked into the topsoil around every one of Vernie's tomato starts, distinct from the surrounding dirt, and asked what it was. "Eggshell," Vernie said, in the tone of someone stating something so obvious it barely needed explaining. "Been doing it my whole life. My mother did it before me, and I expect her mother did it before that, though I couldn't swear to it." Junie asked why. What Vernie told her that afternoon, sitting on an upturned bucket at the edge of her tomato bed while Junie crouched beside her, was the version of the story that had come down through at least 3 generations of women in that family, passed the way most household knowledge passes in farm country, by demonstration and repetition rather than written instruction. Eggshells were mostly calcium, Vernie said, and calcium kept tomatoes from getting that ugly black rot on the bottom, the kind that could ruin half a plant's fruit in a wet summer. And besides that, she said, the crushed shell worked into the soil kept certain soft-bodied bugs and slugs from crawling across it comfortably, since the sharp edges didn't sit well against something without a shell of its own to protect it. Her own mother had called it a poor woman's fertilizer, Vernie said, back in a time and a place, the Deep Depression years in a hollow not far from where they were sitting, when nobody had $2 to spend on anything bought at a farm supply store, and the chickens gave you eggshells for free every single day of the year whether you asked for them or not. Junie went home that evening and told her mother she wanted to try it in their own garden. Odessa, who ran a tight and sensible operation and had genuinely never had much patience for garden folklore that didn't show measurable results, told her daughter she was welcome to try it on her own section, a modest 10 by 20 foot plot at the eastern edge of the garden that had been considered informally Junie's to experiment with since she was old enough to hold a hoe without hurting herself. It was, in Odessa's mind, a reasonable compromise between encouraging a child's curiosity and not letting that curiosity interfere with a garden that fed the family through most of the summer and a good part of the winter besides, once the canning was done. Ray, hearing about the plan at supper that night, laughed in the easy, unbothered way of a man who genuinely didn't think it would amount to much either way. "Long as you're not neglecting your chores for it," he said, which was, almost word for word, the same thing his own father had told him about anything as a boy that sounded like a distraction from real work. That was all the permission Junie needed, and it turned out to be considerably more permission than she would eventually use. Here is what Junie did not fully understand yet in April, and what she would spend the rest of the year, and then the following 2 years, proving out the hard way, through trial, error, careful record-keeping, and a genuine curiosity that outlasted most 10-year-olds' attention spans by a wide margin. Blossom end rot, the black leathery spot that ruins the bottom of an otherwise healthy tomato, is not actually caused primarily by a lack of calcium in the soil, the way the old folk wisdom Vernie had inherited generally explained it. Most agricultural extension research on the subject, going back decades, points instead to inconsistent watering as the dominant cause, uneven moisture that disrupts a plant's ability to move the calcium that's already present in most soils up into the developing fruit where it's actually needed. A tomato plant that goes from bone dry to waterlogged and back again over the course of a week, which describes an awful lot of gardens through an unpredictable Appalachian summer, will often show blossom end rot even in soil that tests perfectly adequate for calcium. This was the more complicated, less satisfying truth that Vernie's simpler explanation had skipped entirely, the way a lot of inherited household knowledge simplifies a real mechanism into something easier to remember and pass down. But eggshells, it turns out, do something genuinely useful anyway, just not always for the precise reason people historically assumed, and this is the part of the story that took Junie the better part of 3 growing seasons to fully work out on her own, mostly through observation rather than any book. Ground fine enough, eggshells do break down slowly over a season or two and do contribute usable calcium to soil, particularly to soil that is naturally calcium poor to begin with, which describes a great deal of the acidic red clay through the Appalachian foothills, including most of Haywood County. In soil that already tests adequate for calcium, the effect on blossom end rot specifically is likely to be modest at best, since the underlying watering inconsistency remains unaddressed. But separately, and this is the mechanism that would end up mattering more in Junie's particular garden than the calcium ever did, crushed shell worked into the surface layer of soil creates a rough, gritty physical barrier that soft-bodied pests, slugs especially, and to a lesser extent cutworms, are genuinely reluctant to cross. This has nothing to do with chemistry or nutrition at all. It's simply a mechanical deterrent, the same basic principle behind diatomaceous earth used for the same purpose in more conventional pest management, and it works because a slug's soft, moist underside reacts badly to abrasive, sharp-edged material. What Junie had, without knowing the full science of any of it that first spring, was 2 real and separate mechanisms working in her favor, layered on top of a garden practice that nobody else left in her immediate family had bothered to keep up with for at least 1 full generation, since Vernie's own daughter, Junie's grandmother, had moved to town in the 1970s and given up gardening almost entirely once she no longer had the acreage for it. Junie started small that April and got progressively more serious as the season wore on, in a way that surprised everyone who knew her, including her own mother. She began saving every eggshell from her own family's kitchen, rinsing them out under the tap and letting them air dry on a cookie sheet balanced on the back porch rail before crushing them in the coffee can with the back of a spoon. Within 3 weeks, this supply proved nowhere near enough for the ambitions she'd started developing for her plot, and she began walking to her nearest neighbors on Saturday afternoons, a rotating cast of 5 or 6 households within reasonable walking distance who mostly found the whole request amusing but were happy enough to hand over a carton of shells they would otherwise have simply thrown into the compost or the trash. By the middle of July she had recruited 4 households into what amounted to an informal eggshell saving network, none of whom expected much of anything to come of it beyond a polite excuse for a strange, determined kid to visit their porch once a week. The first full month of the experiment was mostly frustrating, in the particular way that any genuine experiment tends to be frustrating before a person figures out the actual technique involved. Junie ground the shells too coarse in her earliest attempts, and when she worked the resulting grit into the soil around her tomato transplants, the pieces sat too large and jagged near the tender root zone, which her mother pointed out one evening probably wasn't doing the young plants any particular favors, whatever benefit the shell might eventually provide. Junie went back to Vernie's the following Saturday for advice, frustrated in the specific way a 10-year-old gets frustrated when a plan isn't working the way she'd pictured it. Vernie told her the shell needed to be ground close to a fine powder, roughly the texture of coarse sand, both to break down at any useful rate over the course of a season and to avoid physically damaging tender young roots when worked directly into the topsoil near a transplant. Junie switched that week from the spoon to an old wooden rolling pin she found in the back of a kitchen drawer, crushing the fully dried shells inside a folded dish towel on the porch floor until the resulting texture matched what Vernie demonstrated for her between her fingers, a comparison the two of them repeated most Saturdays through May until Junie could judge the right consistency without needing to ask. It took most of the month of June to get the entire process reliably consistent, from drying through crushing through the actual working of the material into the soil at the right depth and the right distance from each plant stem, and by the time Junie had genuinely figured it out, roughly half of her 10 by 20 plot had already gone into the ground for the season without the full benefit of the technique, planted in the earlier, cruder version of the method she'd start with in April. Her older cousin Dell, 16 that summer and a frequent weekend presence helping Ray with fence repair and other odd jobs around the property, thought the entire project was a fairly hilarious way for a 10-year-old to spend a summer that could otherwise have been spent doing something, in his estimation, more fun. "You're growing tomatoes with garbage," he told her more than once, watching her crush shells against the porch railing with the rolling pin, dust and small fragments scattering across the boards. Her younger brother, Cole, 7 that year, thought the whole process looked genuinely disgusting up close and refused for most of the summer to get anywhere near the coffee can or the drying trays, though he was entirely willing to eat whatever eventually came off the vine, a contradiction Junie found more amusing than annoying. Odessa watched the whole project unfold from a polite, slightly bemused distance through most of May and June, checking in occasionally with a question or two, careful not to actively discourage her daughter's evident enthusiasm but privately expecting, if she was honest with herself, that Junie's section would end up looking roughly the same as the rest of the garden by August, maybe marginally better from the sheer extra attention, maybe not different at all. By late July, the difference had become genuinely hard to miss, even for someone who hadn't been specifically watching for it. Junie's tomato plants, several rows of the same mid-season slicing variety her mother had started from a single seed packet purchased that spring, the identical genetic stock split between Junie's experimental plot and Odessa's conventionally managed section, were showing dramatically less blossom and rot than the fruit developing in the section Odessa managed with her usual careful watering schedule and standard balanced fertilizer. Junie kept a rough running count in a school composition notebook she'd started using specifically for the purpose, tallying affected fruit against healthy fruit each week in a format she'd more or less invented herself, having no idea until much later in the summer that her own great-aunt had kept a remarkably similar log decades earlier, a detail Vernie only mentioned once Junie showed her the notebook in August. Beyond the tomatoes specifically, Junie's cucumber and summer squash plants, which she had started applying the crushed shell treatment to as well once she began running out of fresh tomato bed to work it into, showed noticeably less slug damage along their lower leaves compared to the same varieties growing entirely untreated roughly 10 feet away in an adjacent section of the family garden. Odessa, who had gone into the summer genuinely expecting mild, passing curiosity from her daughter and not much more than that, began paying much closer attention around the first week of August. She walked Junie's section with her one warm evening after supper, comparing leaf by leaf and fruit by fruit against her own adjacent rows, and found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, genuinely unable to explain away the visible difference with anything besides what her daughter had actually been doing all summer, methodically, week after week, with a patience Odessa hadn't entirely credited her with possessing. She mentioned the whole thing to Ray at supper later that week, more thoughtfully than she'd discussed it before, and Ray, who had mostly tuned the entire project out through June and July as a passing kid's hobby not worth much comment, went out to look for himself the following morning before leaving for work. He didn't say a great deal about it, in keeping with his general habit of not saying a great deal about most things, But he started saving his own coffee cup eggshells on a saucer by the kitchen sink without being asked by anyone, a small, unspoken gesture that Odessa privately understood as roughly the equivalent of a standing ovation coming from her husband. Word moved through the small surrounding community the way information tends to move in a county that size, gradually and mostly through casual conversation rather than any formal announcement, principally through the Clyde Farmers Market where Odessa sold surplus vegetables most Saturday mornings through the growing season. A woman running the local extension office's information booth that particular August, a patient, thorough agent named Willa Prentice who had worked Haywood County for close to a decade, struck up a conversation with Odessa about an unusually clean-looking crate of tomatoes on her table one Saturday and ended up hearing the whole story secondhand about Junie's summer-long experiment. Willa asked, with what struck Odessa as genuine professional interest rather than polite conversation, whether she might come out and see the garden section for herself sometime that week. The following Tuesday, Willa walked the full Hargett garden with Junie leading the way, asking the kind of careful, specific, technically informed questions that made it fairly clear to both Odessa and Junie that she was taking a 10-year-old summer project considerably more seriously than most of the family's own neighbors had managed to over the preceding 4 months. Willa didn't credit the folk explanation of the practice uncritically, and she said as much plainly to Junie that afternoon, walking her gently through the more complicated actual science behind blossom end rot and calcium and inconsistent watering that Verney's simpler, inherited version of the story had never covered. But she also told Junie, standing at the edge of the tomato rows with the notebook of weekly counts in her hand, that what she was observing in the garden was entirely real regardless of which specific part of the old family explanation held up under closer scrutiny and which part didn't quite hold together, and that the pest deterrent effect in particular, documented consistently across an entire growing season in Junie's own careful notes, was genuinely worth writing up formally. She asked whether the county extension office might feature Junie's plot, alongside a proper explanation of the actual underlying mechanisms involved. Small Farm and Home Garden newsletter, the same modest quarterly publication that went out to every household on the extension's mailing list across Haywood County. By the time the Haywood County Fair arrived that September, Odessa had entered a crate of produce from her daughter's section into the open vegetable competition almost as an afterthought, mostly because Junie had asked directly and it seemed considerably easier to simply say yes than to explain at length why not. The judges that year, working steadily through several dozen entries submitted from gardens scattered across the county, spent noticeably longer at the Hargett family's table than at most of the others, turning individual tomatoes over carefully in their hands, checking the smooth, entirely unblemished undersides that a surprising number of the competing entries that year conspicuously lacked. Junie's tomatoes took first place outright in her age division that September, along with a special mention from the fair's head judge, an older man who had been judging the county's produce competition for the better part of 2 decades and had, by his own account afterward, genuinely never seen a set of entries quite that consistently clean. He asked Odessa directly what the secret was, clearly expecting to hear about a particular brand of fertilizer or some newer hybrid seed variety he hadn't yet encountered. Odessa told him, with a straight face, that it was mostly the work of a 10-year-old and a coffee can full of crushed eggshells, and the judge laughed out loud before realizing, from her expression, that she genuinely wasn't joking. That single county fair result, small as it might sound described plainly, ended up being the beginning of something considerably larger than a single summer's garden experiment, though nobody standing at that fair table in September could have known it at the time. The extension newsletter piece that Willa Prentice had proposed ran that November, a modest 2-page feature with photographs of Junie's plot alongside a careful, properly hedged explanation of Eggshell Amendment's real and limited benefits, distinguishing plainly between the calcium contribution and the separate mechanical pest deterrent, and noting honestly where the inherited folk explanation had oversimplified the underlying science. The piece went out to roughly 1,100 households across the county, and over the following winter, Odessa began fielding occasional questions at the farmers' market from other gardeners who'd read it and wanted to know more, a steady trickle of curiosity that Junie, now 11, took considerable personal pride in answering herself whenever she happened to be at the market table. The following spring, the second full year of the project, Junie expanded her section considerably, with her mother's now enthusiastic rather than merely tolerant cooperation, taking over roughly a third of the family's total garden space and formally recruiting 2 additional neighboring households into what had by then become a genuinely established eggshell-saving network spanning 6 families altogether. She refined her record-keeping that second year, tracking not just blossom end rot incidents and slug damage but rough yield comparisons between treated and untreated rows of the same varieties, data that, by the end of that second season, showed a consistent enough pattern that Will Apprentice asked whether the extension office might expand its original feature into a longer piece the following year, potentially with some informal involvement from a soil scientist at a nearby university. Extension campus who had expressed interest after seeing the original newsletter. Vernie, watching all of this unfold from her own garden 2 farms over, found the whole development quietly gratifying in a way she didn't often put into words, though she did tell Junie plainly, on one of their continuing Saturday visits, that she'd never once in her own long life expected anybody to write an official newsletter piece about something her own mother had simply done every summer out of Depression-era necessity, without a second thought about whether the calcium explanation was scientifically precise. What mattered, Vernie said, wasn't really whether her mother's original explanation had gotten every detail exactly right. What mattered was that the practice itself had survived long enough, passed down carefully enough through enough generations of women who bothered to actually teach it rather than just mention it, for a curious 10-year-old to eventually test it properly and find out for herself which parts held up. By the 3rd growing season, Junie's project had effectively become the primary organizing structure for her family's entire kitchen garden, with Odessa's original, more conventional section reduced to a smaller comparison plot kept specifically to maintain the ongoing data set the Extension Office was now formally tracking as part of a modest regional study on traditional soil amendment practices in Appalachian home gardens. Ray, who had started the whole endeavor with a mild, unbothered shrug about not neglecting chores, had by that 3rd summer become the family's primary eggshell processor, having built a simple hand-cranked grinding contraption out of spare parts from the road department's scrap pile specifically to speed up the crushing process for the considerably larger volume the expanded garden now required. There is an old and fairly durable truth in farming, one that Junie's own great-aunt Vernie had lived by for the better part of 6 decades without ever needing to put it into quite so many formal words, and it's this: the answer to a persistent problem is very often sitting somewhere close at hand, in a person's own kitchen trash or a forgotten family habit, long before anybody thinks to look there seriously. Junie hadn't invented anything genuinely new that first summer, and she would have been the first to say so herself by the time she was old enough to fully understand what she'd actually done. She had taken a half-remembered, half-correctly explained practice that her own family had quietly let lapse for 1 full generation, tested it properly and patiently over multiple seasons with real record-keeping, and worked out for herself, with help from a great-aunt who remembered the practice and an extension agent who understood the actual chemistry behind it, precisely which parts of the old inherited story held up under honest observation and which parts didn't. Junie is 13 now. The extended eggshell network she started as a 10-year-old still operates every summer across what has grown to 8 participating households. Vernie, now into her late 80s, still keeps her own garden 2 farms over, still eats her tomatoes straight off the vine without washing them first, and now, most Saturdays through the growing season, she has company doing exactly the same thing, a girl who took her great-aunt's half-explained inheritance and turned it into something documented, tested, and passed carefully forward again. What old family garden practices have you seen actually hold up under real scrutiny? Drop it in the comments below, we read every single one, and tell us where you're watching from tonight. And if a story like this one, patient and quiet and ultimately about paying attention, is worth your time, go ahead and subscribe, because there's another one waiting for you next week.